Welcome, everybody, and happy Wednesday. My name is Rob Luzinski with the Stewardship Network, and welcome to our monthly webcast series. We'll be getting started in just a minute here. Let people start trickling in, but while you're joining us, feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. You can tell us who you are, where you're tuning in from, and if you represent an organization. And then just a friendly reminder that we'll be using the chat for comments and for sharing of resources and such, but we ask that you use the Q&A function to ask any of your questions because that's easier for us to keep track of. And with that, I think we'll go ahead and get started with our intro. So thank you all again for joining us today. Again, my name is Rob Luzinski with the Stewardship Network. So a little bit about us. We are a 501c3 nonprofit organization with an award-winning 20-year history. We are now serving 20-plus place-based TSN member communities from the Great Lakes to the Pacific Ocean. And our free TSN webcasts happen on the second Wednesday of each month at the Eastern Time Zone's noon hour. Our mission is to connect, equip, and mobilize people and organizations to care for land and water in their communities. I'd like to tell you a little bit more about each of those aspects of our mission. So first of all, connect. We like to connect the specialized knowledge we've collected from and for TSN member communities and share it as widely as possible. So there are many different examples of how we engage the general public and our member communities around information and resource sharing and any opportunities to really build a groundswell of support for stewardship. The equip aspect of our mission, we remove hurdles for TSN member communities so they can pour thousands of annual work hours into their ecosystems. There are many different examples of how we support our TSN member communities, and the main goal is to make sure that they can be out in the field doing the important work, and we help with some of the back-end things that will make that work a little bit easier and hopefully a little bit more effective. So we're very appreciative for all the on-the-ground work that our member communities do, and we do our best to support them in those ventures. And lastly, mobilize. Through our TSN member communities, we make collaborative ecological stewardship accessible to all. And so there are many different examples of how we help to mobilize our member communities and the general public around making an on-the-ground impact. And so if you think of the equip pillar as helping to give folks the tools to make these activities possible, mobilize is the actual manifestation of that work and of all of the possibilities that we are able to create together. So without further ado, I would love to introduce Shawn Johnson, who is the Managing Director of the Center for Natural Resources and Environmental Policy at the University of Montana. And his talk today will be Beyond the First Horizon, Exploring Tomorrow's Stewardship Opportunities. Shawn, feel free to take it away.
Great, thanks, Rob. Really appreciate the opportunity to be with you all here today, and good to see a couple of very familiar names on the participant list as you guys are jumping in. We've got people here who I consider friends, colleagues, mentors, thought leaders in this space, and so really appreciate the chance to just share some of my thoughts and observations as I think about the work that we do. Also, just maybe a footnote to my title that Rob shared. I have the privilege of being the director of this center at the University of Montana. I also have the honor of serving as a Stewardship Network board member, and really think that so much of our work is about the intersections of our lives in different places and different spaces and the opportunity to grow and connect those. And so those will be threads that you'll hear throughout this. And just in terms of the title itself, Beyond the First Horizon is kind of a play on a couple of different threads in my own life. One was the opportunity to get to be a part of a group called Future Horizons over the last couple of years that was incubated through some work of the California Landscape Stewardship Network. It's also a framework that I'll be part of a framework that I'll be describing earlier about systems change and how we think beyond the first horizon, which tends to capture a lot of our thought and interest because it's the day-to-day of our life, and really move into the future. Rob, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I think as soon as I do that, yours will stop, correct?
I believe that's right. Yep. And just for what it's worth, we are super happy to have Shawn as a board member. He is wonderful. And thank you very much for adding that intro. And yes, it is looking good for me. So I will mute and stop my video.
Great, thanks so much. And Rob mentioned this too, but I will offer it as well. If you've got questions, we are going to have time at the end of today's conversation to engage with you all in your questions, your observations. And so feel free to use that Q&A function throughout today's presentation, or if there's something you want to share in the chat function, please go ahead and do that as well. Glad to take those, as you think about them, and go ahead and drop them into those different buttons, and then we'll get to them here in a little bit. Also want to just share that a lot of what I'm going to present today is not answers. It's not like, here's how. It's not very prescriptive, but it is really based on a lot of observations that I've been able to look at from different perspectives and be a part of different conversations. And so just a little bit of context about me and my background and where some of these observations are coming from. So it's always hard to learn much about someone from their title. I get to be a part of this applied research center at the University of Montana, where I lead a graduate certificate program on campus in natural resources conflict resolution, where we're really looking at natural resource issues, environmental challenges from that perspective that people really have diverse interests in how they connect to resources, to place, to each other. And that if we're going to make progress in addressing challenges or reaching opportunities or solving or addressing conflicts that are inherent in that complexity, we really need to spend time examining the dynamics at play and figuring out how to engage in those differently. And at the university, we've come up with a little bit of a simple formula. I think that it's really about addressing the substance of the issue in the context of people and process. So bringing together the right people with the right experience, expertise, knowledge, creativity, and the right process, how to guide them effectively through those group norms and dynamics that are so complex and often vexing. So that's part of my work. Off campus, I actually get to work with a whole bunch of really creative people in resource agencies at the state and federal level, with tribal partners, with partnerships that are based in community and different landscapes, and with people like you who are really thinking about how they can be change agents in their own communities and foster and advance changes. So that's really the focus of so much of this work. Through that, I've been really privileged to be a part of a whole bunch of different communities of practice or learning networks, including the Stewardship Network, the Network for Landscape Conservation, the Western Collaborative Conservation Network, the California Landscape Stewardship Network, the International Land Conservation Network. There's all these different groups that are really trying to foster and advance learning, and we'll get to how that plays into some of my observations here later. But just wanted to do that to set the stage in terms of my professional track and where these observations are coming from. Personally, I grew up in Montana, had a wonderful childhood exploring the backcountry in the Front Range of the Rocky Mountains in Montana. Also spent a lot of time on my grandparents' ranch, and it was from them that I kind of had those first views of my future that included kind of this intersection of connecting to place and connecting to people. So learning that stewardship ethic from them, learning how important a connection to place is, and then connecting that to try to really advance, this stewardship ethic, this ethic of place. All right, so now we'll jump in. And I'm going to start here, which I hope is a little bit provocative, because I feel like so much of the work that we do in stewardship and collaborative practice is hopeful. And I actually think there's an inherent tension in this that informs and inspires the way that we engage in the work. So this is a quote from Simon Zadek. He said, "Partners think that collaboration will change the world. Then it doesn't. And they think that it failed. But often the collaboration changed something, the way some part of the system works and delivers outcomes. It's a matter of understanding the nature of change itself." And so I think my hope for today is let's dig into that. Let's try to understand the nature of change itself and the things that we're trying to change through our interactions and conversation. part of this is just thinking about the setting or the context of the work. Much of my work happens in the realm of environmental stewardship, land use planning, land management. And so as one frame, we might imagine this evolving approach to natural resource management. And I put a little subtitle here around a return to stewardship, because at least in this example that I'm sharing, the early movement is really embedded in indigenous stewardship, that traditional ecological knowledge, that connection to place, that interaction as part of an ecosystem. And then through the exploration and advancement of the kind of European expansion across the world, and especially across North America, this is really looking at it in that North American context. We have those frontier days that were really about how do we harness, control, and use resources. Exploitation, protection really came about first only 100 years ago, 100 plus years ago, at the beginning of the national park system and other places to preserve and protect these really special places, and then really focusing on, well, what's the role of science as a tool in managing more effectively, more efficiently. And as you can see, as we go through this, we've really kind of built in increasing layers of complexity and nuance that bring us back to kind of this connected system of social and ecological systems, and how do we understand what those dynamics are and steward them effectively, and where are we going from here? How do we actually create the systems and the structures that both do that and prepare us for the next evolution? And so here we get into this frame around different horizons as a way to navigate these different systems and system changes and evolutionary moments. And so this is a adaptation from Bill Sharp, and he was at the International Futures Forum when he developed and brought forth this concept, and other people have used it in different places, so it might be a familiar one to some of you. But it's really thinking about these three horizons as a conceptual frame, and showing them all at once is a little bit of a spoiler alert. It's nice to see these kind of in sequence, and thinking about Horizon 1 is really where we spend a lot of our time. It's the day-to-day management of what we have. It's trying to keep up with tasks and projects and payroll and HR. It's trying to really engage with the conversations that are front and center, and trying to solve those problems and understand the interests behind them. Horizon 3 is really a hopeful place that we don't spend a lot of time thinking about, but it's that normative world. It's the world we're striving toward. It's the what if our world looked like this? What would we imagine that to be? And that's a place of emergence, where we can think about different paradigms, different ideas, and different innovations. And I get really inspired by that space. And I also feel like it's an often undernourished space. In between, we have the second horizon, and you can think about that in a couple of different ways. It's the place where we get to imagine a path between horizons 1 and 3. And as we do that, it's not just let's put together some strategies, but that in and of itself is a place that requires innovation, creativity, problem solving, often experimentation that leads to not hopeful outcomes all the time, but sometimes failures. And how do we learn from those? How do we grow through those? Horizon 2 is also a space that's fraught with danger of returning to Horizon 1 instead of advancing towards Horizon 3. And so how do we think about those practices that can actually lead us to new ways of thinking, and not just those that reinforce past ways of doing and thinking? Certainly, it's important for those of us that might have a little bit of fear of change, or not really sure that it's always in our best interests. This isn't suggesting that things are working should go away, but it is thinking really intentionally about which of those things might we change, adapt, evolve, build upon in order to reach that more hopeful and complete picture of the future we'd like. Another way to look at change, and this is from a book that I've really grown to love called The Gardens of Democracy. a new American story of citizenship, the economy, and the role of government, right? Really captivating title. Thinking about some of the challenging pieces of our world and the way we live, but I love how what it does is say, well, context does matter, and context of natural resource management is one context, but more broadly, what we're seeing is a very similar change in our understanding of how complex, how adaptive the world is. And so this is just saying that really in terms of our scientific understanding, the knowledge building that occurs in places like college campuses is uncovering the same thing in different places, different modes of understanding. And whether it's botany or biology, we're seeing our understanding shift from something that was atomized and simple to something that's now complex and networked, where we had hoped that things would return to some sort of equilibrium. What we're seeing is that disequilibrium is often the norm, and it's about the complexity, the effervescence of our systems that we need to better understand, that it's not always just about becoming more efficient, but actually looking at the outcomes. Are you achieving something that's effective, that's actually advancing your goal or your interest? Can we move from always understanding causation to something that's really understanding the correlation in a relationship and thinking about how that interdependence can be adaptive over time? I love this one where he's talking about the shift from being rational calculators to irrational approximators. That's just saying that within some of these complex adaptive systems, sometimes the best we can do is use the best information that we have and think about what might we do with that and kind of approximate that next step instead of have that certainty that we're hoping for. But the last couple of things I think are really important in how we do the work and how we relate to one another. And that's that interests matter, and that we shouldn't think about power over, but power with, and moving from a win-lose orientation to each other and to our relationship with the natural world into a win-win, or actually seeing that as the lose-lose that is if we aren't able to find those mutual benefits. And so in that case, moving from a relationship that's often been characterized as competitive to something that is more in the spirit of cooperation, or that we see the competitiveness of our conversations is really discerning conversations that allow us to be more creative and more innovative than we've maybe been in the past. And so frameworks are really helpful in sorting through change. And I love this image from Kirk Emerson, who really thinks about collaborative environmental governance as a way to make sense of that context and also facilitate action. So you can think about everything that I've shared in terms of the context of change in time over the natural resource management regimes and those eras, or just these changes that came forward from the Gardens of Democracy framework as this system context, or the outer ring of this diagram. And what we're often focused on in our work are these middle pieces where it says collaboration dynamics. This is where we come together usually to do one of three things. One thing we might want to do is address a conflict that is inhibiting progress. Another thing we might want to do is solve a shared problem. A third thing we might want to do is reach a shared opportunity that no one has the ability to do on their own. But to do that, we really need to have this bigger picture. What are those things that are really bigger than any of us and facilitating, fostering, or in some ways impeding those conversations that we're having? And how do we bring those pieces together? And so this is just saying that we need that collaborative governance regime. Those are the people who have a stake in an issue, an interest in an issue, a contribution to make. And they come together through these dynamics to foster actions that change outcomes that in turn change the system itself. And so if you go back to that Simon Zedek quote at the very beginning of the presentation, these are the things that we're maybe not paying attention to at times, but are critical to systems change over time, that these actions actually change something in that system. They change something in that broader sphere of interactions that over time will either facilitate or impede our progress. Putting this into another context, In this case, I'm going to use the example of the work that I've been fortunate to be a part of at the Network for Landscape Conservation and through other stewardship network efforts, where we've got these place-based communities, these landscape scale communities of practice coming together to be these creative problem-solving entities, to really find that collaborative dynamic that was in the previous slide, create actions that foster change. Each of those in isolation is really fascinating and provides case studies and examples that we can learn from and share with each other to advance work in different places and different communities. And collectively, they actually represent systems change. They represent how we're changing how we govern ourselves, how we connect to solve problems differently. And this is a wonderful diagram of systems change from some folks at the Resilience Center, the Stockholm Resilience Center in Sweden. And what I like about it is that it really follows, in my experience, the systems change that's underway in the collaborative stewardship and conservation community, where 15 years ago, when I started learning about this community and becoming connected to their work, we were really down in this small scale, micro level, isolated space where we saw really hopeful seeds being planted around people coming together in different ways to achieve outcomes that were really novel, unique, compelling, really unicorns in a sense of really thinking differently about the world. But they were very countercultural. They were not the norm. They were hard to sustain. Yet over time, they inspired others to think about, well, how do we come together in our place around the community that we care about, or around the issues that we want to make progress on, and learn from that. And so over time, you'll see that what happens from those seeds that are planted is it really starts to bubble up, where people start talking about that. And they ask really hard, discerning questions. What are we talking about? What are those new narratives? What is that new vision we might imagine for our future? And so there's this back and forth between the meso and micro level that allows coalitions to emerge, like the Stewardship Network, like the Network for Landscape Conservation, where over time, there's mutual reinforcement, there's shared learning, there's understanding about different scales of action. You're starting to see opportunities emerge at different levels within different communities, and you start to see cross-pollination, not in a way that just facilitates individual success, but is actually starting to shift those narratives and lived experiences. And all of that helps further articulate what this is and how we do it and why we do it. And in my experience, I see the conversation shift from saying, oh, we're doing these things in place so that we don't have to reinvent the wheel, to, oh, we're actually changing the conditions on the ground, to, oh, we're actually changing institutions and federal policy and state policy. And now we're having completely different conversations around the ways we make investment in each other through these collaborative stewardship networks in order to advance a different vision for the future. I actually think that within the context of at least community-based and landscape scale stewardship, we're at this transition phase where we're seeing a window of opportunity in conversation at all scales, at the community level, the state level, the regional level, the national level, and even internationally, where people are looking for new ways of doing things, where the institutions, the practices, the economic norms, the markets that we've inherited are no longer sufficient for us to meet the challenges of today or prepare us to meet the challenges of tomorrow. So we're really thinking differently and wanting to innovate forward in a way that does allow us to unlock potential that either isn't currently there or that we can create together. So I'm really excited about where we are as a community, and I'm really hopeful that the practices that we're seeing in Ann Arbor or in California or in other places across the country are going to not just be experiments anymore, but they'll become institutionalized, and that we'll start to use language, we'll start to use practices that are not countercultural, but are really part of our worldview. So let's keep our eyes on that and see where things go. But then, just to complete the picture here, that in turn becomes the norm, that we will pass forward institutions, practices, norms, paradigms, ways of thinking that the next generation will inherit. All of that to say, I think we're at a critical juncture, and you can think about it with a whole bunch of different words, different language, different ways of thinking. But at its core, I would say, I see the need to shape conversation around new skills. If that's the world that we are creating, what do you need to know? What do you need to be able to do? What are the skills, the practices that you need to bring into those spaces? And what are the approaches that will foster and facilitate? Certainly, it's in service to different ways of thinking, new paradigms. It will be important to come up with new language so that we can communicate effectively to advance that vision, and in turn, create these new systems. So this is an invitation for us to move into this space of what I'm calling social change agents and entrepreneurs, where I think, at least for me personally, growing into these different professional spaces that I've been a part of, so much of it was not focused on taking the risk to be innovative, to be creative, to potentially fail, but rather to be certain, to be assured that we could reach the outcomes that we're telling our funder, our agency partners, and others that we're going to be able to achieve, and rather to really step outside the box and strive towards that third horizon, and not get stuck in that first horizon. So how do we engage in creative ways to bridge what I'm calling a gap in governance, which to me just simply means that our existing collaborative environmental governance regime, whatever we want to call it, is insufficient. It can't do all the things that we want to do. There's a gap between where we are and where we want to be. How do we close that gap? By being creative, by being innovative, by being open to risk, by being open to uncertainty, by being open to the adaptations that we'll need. So that requires experimentation, adaptation, and courage that I think are underemphasized in our current community of practice. Let's challenge ourselves to step into those spaces and really grow in important ways. If we do that, we can improve, not always by getting things right, but always by learning. And a learning orientation is what has really emerged in my own professional practice and pathway as the North Star for everything that I'm doing. As long as I'm learning and growing, I'm inspired, I can contribute, I can give back, I can learn from others and with others to advance the work that we're doing in our communities. And that's within and across efforts. We might have, a whole bunch of things happening at the community-based level that are important to share across. We're also always learning within each community because things are relational and adaptive. And hopefully, that does not just foster learning, but decreases that risk of failure as we're connected and growing together. To do that well requires connections. And I'm just saying that all of those things that I listed as new points are really intersecting points. So system, structure, processes, knowledge, skills, language, all of that needs to co-evolve so that we can carry forward and implement and evolve that together. And I think what I love about the evolution of this work is that in that space of becoming more relational, it requires us to connect in a way that's authentic and relational and sets us up in conversation with each other in new ways. And I remember an aha moment for me early on in this work where I needed to shift my paradigm or my way of thinking to say, I'm not an analyst necessarily who's going to bring forward the right information to help advance a problem. But I'm someone who can do something different than that, which is set the table for a whole bunch of different voices to come together. And I think so often in the way that we think or that we've historically been a part of conversations, we aren't necessarily thinking about, well, who gets to set that table and who gets to be a part of that. And the work that I think we get to do together is really think about, gosh, if we're trying to solve a problem or reach a particular outcome, How do we set the table with the right people, the right information, and the right process to make a real difference? I think so much of this work happens through networks. And if you haven't seen this documentary from our friends at Converge, I really would encourage you to do that. I'm just going to show the trailer here real quickly so that people can get the key takeaway points.
Nothing is in isolation, right? Everything is interconnected.
I think networks are probably the perfect structure for today's world.
To bring different people from different sectors to come together for a common goal and for a common good that then achieves something that wouldn't have otherwise happened if they hadn't come together.
With networks, we have the flexibility to innovate and to address challenges in real time.
I would say that networks in the end are going to show us the way forward.
All right, so networks are going to show us the way forward. How is that? Well, let me give you some examples based on some of the networks I've been involved in. I'm going to bring forward a few of the conceptual models that networks that I've been a part of are bringing forward for our consideration and shared learning. And so these are conceptual models that were seeded, advanced, born out of conversations of the Future Horizons working group. And they're all emergent. They're all food for thought, but they're all super instructive as we think outside the box, as we think about what is it that we need to shift towards as we imagine a new paradigm, a new language, different relationships, and the skills and abilities to work within a different system. There's a few of these that I'm going to walk through, and each of them I think are compelling on their own, and then there are some interesting intersection points. So this one you can see is built around the idea of a stool that has the three legs of collaborative leadership, measuring impact, and language and knowledge, all in service to a community that can be empowered with self-determination. So they have the ability, the responsibility to chart their own path forward within a system that's grounded in balancing social, ecological, and economic elements of that community. And really, if you look at the legs of the stool, thinking about what does that take with respect to thinking, the language, the knowledge, the skills, the actions, the approaches, the mind, the heart set, the mindset, and then the measuring impact, not as a place to say, are you being held accountable to, but are you learning? Are you able to foster the conversations that will lead to the insights that allow you to adapt and grow as a community? Pretty interesting to see in this one, this Venn diagram approach, really similar components. So we've got that systems and policy piece where they're drawing forward those social, ecological, or environmental and economic elements. They're thinking about language in a different way here around the thinking, the communication, the skill around messaging and communication. They're thinking about mentorship and collaborative leadership here together. So that's the learning and the practices or the approach drawn into one circle, and that results in a change in mindset over time. So how do we think about those? And then in turn, how do those elements drive action and activity moving forward? One of the conversations within one of the working groups of this Future Horizons team was really thinking about, if we're really going to reach hearts and minds, how do we not sound so wonky and so abstract and theoretical and use all these models, but just make this commonplace, make it cool and easy. So really thinking about, how do we invite more people into the conversation by broadening the players? How do we disrupt patterns so that we're not falling back into practices that inhibit progress, but are really disruptive and able to move the needle from Horizon 1 to Horizon 3? How do we soften partitions? So recognizing that much of, at least the way that we've advanced knowledge in the university context, has been through deepening knowledge within silos or within disciplines? Or if you look at a map, how do we think about who owns a particular parcel of land or manages a particular parcel of land? How do we think about softening those boundaries that impede more holistic thinking to find permeability? So looking for those places where those connections can actually foster resilience within the system. And then there are a couple more of these that are conceptual, that are grounded both in imagery and words. And so really thinking about that this isn't separate from, but embedded within place within the broader ecological world. We've got here this nice skyscape over a marsh where the essential elements are around a governance regime that's locally led but nationally scaled, so that we have to make those connections across different geographic scales and different scales of action. And those relationships are in service to this idea of intersectional landscape stewardship, so that it's including all voices and all disciplines, that it's for and in service to provisions that help us thrive as a community, a community of people and the natural world. And that means caring for the well-being of our air and water and our sense of place and history. And that it's about shared responsibility and accountability through democratic and participatory decision-making processes, that this isn't about someone else providing this for us, but it's us including our own voices in these different conversations and finding the way forward through engagement rather than through separation. And finally, this conceptual model of a tree, where at the bottom, this call towards being our true selves, where our true needs are met. So again, not putting ourselves in a box, but really trying to be as authentic as possible, and thinking about how do we work through the structural, relational, and conceptual pieces of our work. The conceptual pieces here that they offer are, like, can we become this risk embracing culture that fosters innovation and creativity? Can we do that not just through scientific inquiry, but through storytelling? Can we access indigenous wisdom, and can we include the arts and the inspiration that comes from the creative partners in our communities as much as we can from the scientific partners? Can we really think about community not just as a place for shared problem solving, but a place of mutual support and belonging? And as we think about advancing that, how do we do it in a way where our structures support those outcomes that are more relational and conceptual, with sufficient funding and capacity, with education and workforce pathways, and with purpose-filled jobs and lifestyle? So again, these were the musings of our Future Horizons working group, and I think are really that place for us to continue dialogue and discernment around, well, what is possible? How do we get there? And how do we start putting into place actions and activities that aren't just project-based, but are paradigm shifting based? And to me, so much of this work happens in the work that the Stewardship Network and other networks are doing. And so much of it happens at what I call the intersection of communities of practice and communities of place. I think so much of the work when I began was really focused on communities of place. Like, how do you work within a collaborative watershed group or a collaborative large landscape stewardship or conservation effort to advance their success? And how do you network across and within those to achieve their objectives? I think you do that in part by really working to provide them with the resources, the capacity, the insights that they need. And I think you find these communities of practice that can inform, support, deepen, broaden, and scale and leverage their work in ways that they couldn't on their own. And that's not just by making connections within that network, but beyond it, by thinking about how does a community of practice in communications, in marketing, in markets, whatever it might be, actually engage directly with those communities of practice. And so community of practice is really made up of these three pieces of having that shared area of interest, connecting it with a community who can advance and deepen those interests and build that through a body of knowledge, methods, stories, practices. And I think, I'm seeing more and more that these communities of practice and these communities of place, when they engage with each other, really can make magic. One of those places is, the Network for Landscape Conservation that I mentioned. This is a little bit of our emerging theory of change and how the work that the network is doing is inspired by these conversations that foster activities that create outcomes and that ultimately result in impact, and hopefully that impact intersects directly back with that system and that context and is fostering systems change. As I look at these activities, I can see that none of them are possible just within the existing capacity of the network itself. It really does take connection to and outreach with that broader set of actors that might represent communities of practice in different areas of specialty. So certainly we can convene and facilitate conversations and build relationships on our own, but to amplify and elevate innovation, we really need to think about, well, what are we innovating toward, and who can we bring into those conversations to both inform those conversations, but in turn be the people who might help us bring those conversations forward into these intermediate outcome spaces and really strengthen the work that's happening within communities and learn from. I think that one of the things that we're also seeing when you bring together communities of practice and communities of place is that there's this really emergent nature of so much of the work that is fun and hard to predict, but can actually amplify or bring the work forward in new and novel ways. As we're doing that, we're saying, well, gosh, there's actually some things that we're learning here that are important for how we do this work. And so based on the work that we've done through the Network for Landscape Conservation, the California Landscape Stewardship Network and others, we've begun to play with this collaborative capacity framework where we can say, well, here's some of the new language, here's some of the new approaches, here are some of the things that we can name and fund that can help us shift systems and shift paradigms. And so this framework suggests that there are at least 6 structural elements that we might really think about in building our ability to do this work in partnership in this relational way that helps us engage in complex adaptive systems. And that's bringing people together in a collaborative process to, identify that collective purpose, that shared goal, to create shared strategies and priorities, to identify, foster, and advance collaborative practices, skills, and tools, to build their coordination capacity, to create the systems and infrastructure that support collaboration as the norm, and associated decision-making structures. We know that we have to share power differently and make decisions differently in these structures. Of course, that's all interesting. What makes this, I think, especially compelling and unique is that there's this idea of 3 binding elements that form the mortar between or across these different elements. And that's the places that are really harder to describe and where our language is still evolving, but we know we need to build this sense of belonging. It needs to be a place where all voices are welcome, where all ideas are heard, where our differences result in innovative conversations and creative thinking that wouldn't otherwise occur. And that's because we have these meaningful relationships where we don't have to always agree. We don't have to have groupthink. We don't want that, but we want to access the diversity of the voices and the experiences and the knowledge that we have through this inclusive culture and this mindset that we can not just come together to do something that combines our assets, but actually allows us to do things that combines those assets or abilities in ways that really have an outsized impact, that creates something new that didn't exist before. And we do that with everyone, right? So this is just representative of the kinds of voices that might engage in collaborative problem solving. A couple of place-based examples, just to say, that's really saying a community of practice, like a stewardship network, can advance thinking in an important way to build language and approaches. Communities of place are just as important in building practices and deepening learning. So a couple of examples here: the Blackfoot Challenge is a group in Montana here that is often celebrated, and for good reason, for bringing the community together as a forum for building relationships, understanding challenges, and engaging in collaborative problem solving. And the language they use, I think, is really instructive for all of us, that by following a deliberative process that builds understanding and common ground, conversations lead to on-the-ground solutions for conservation and stewardship, supporting the Blackfoot's many generations to come. And that last piece to me is what's so strong, is that communities of place are not ephemeral, they're not transitory, they're connected to place over the long term. And often when dealing with a watershed group like the Blackfoot Challenge, or especially in the context of having conversations with tribes and indigenous partners, the way you think about a problem as, or a challenge or an opportunity, as being part of your life instead of separate from it, that you're not looking for a short-term solution, you're looking for something that isn't going away or transitory, it really does change the way that you think about something. So grounding something in place and the permanence of place and the community that's connected to that place, and combining it with the insights from a community of practice, really is powerful in that sense. And in that way, this is exactly what the Stewardship Network does. This is one of your member communities, the Central Southwest Cluster, and thinking about how you connect people to place to have that sense of deep connection, where you can invite people in a very relational sense, in a very real sense, to a cafe for a coffee, to a porch in your, on your back deck, to a conversation or a meal. That's important. Those are really foundational relationships. And if they can be informed by and connected to these broader conversations that the Stewardship Network as a community-wide network can advance, that's fantastic. And why? Because the Stewardship Network does things that you can't really do at that place-based level. It's about the learning that comes through connection and shared problem solving. It's about equipping those member communities with practices, tools, simply the systems that they can't achieve on their own. And that mobilizes action and fosters inspiration in ways that wouldn't otherwise occur. All right. Want to just leave with a couple of thoughts here as we go. So how do we actually do this? How do we foster the innovation, the creativity? How do we step into a space that's a little bit more embracing of risk to really find the language, the tools, the approaches that we need? In the latest book, threw up the title there real quick, Connect, Innovate, and Scale Up, How Networks Create System Change by Plastrick, Taylor, and Cleveland. They really point to these 5 skills, and I think they're really instructive for us as specific things that we can do. So associational thinking is a cognitive skill. It's about making connections across unrelated questions or ideas. Innovative breakthroughs often happen by our ability to think across those different buckets. It's sparked by 4 other skills, which are behavioral, and those are the ones below. So this is really focused on how can we learn across different ways of thinking. So questioning, innovators' questions frequently challenge the status quo. So to understand how things really are, and how they might be changed or disrupted, we really need to get into that questioning mode more often. Observing, this is something that I get to do all the time as someone who gets to participate in, help advance and facilitate conversations. When you watch the world around you, it helps you gain insights into not just what's happening, but ideas from other places that you might use that foster different ways of doing things and creative problem solving. Networking. So people who are in this innovative creative space spend a lot of time connecting with, learning from, testing other ideas through different efforts with different people from different walks of life. And so that embracing diversity is a big part of networking, not necessarily the social network communities that we find where maybe those feel a little bit self-reinforcing or like a bubble. And experimenting. Innovators explore the world intellectually and experientially, and they visit new places, try new things, seek new information, and experiment to learn new things. And so maybe those sound a little bit too easy, but how often do we actually take the time to do those things and connect them back to the work that we're doing within our communities of place and our communities of practice? And the last thing I'll say here before opening it up to some Q&A as we close things out for today's webcast is the piece that's often missing, I think, is hope, a little bit of inspiration behind this work to keep us motivated and inspired. And a couple of just voices that resonate with me as we close things out. Rebecca Solnit says, hope is an axe you break down doors with in an emergency, because hope should shove you out the door, because it will take everything you have to steer the future away from endless war, from the annihilation of the earth's treasures and the grinding down of the poor and marginal, right? Things that we can't really live with, we often turn our eyes away from, but hope is actually what gets us through those things. Hope just means another world might be possible. Not promised, not guaranteed. Hope calls for action, and action is impossible without hope. And then this one from D. Hawk, in times such as these, it's no failure to fall short of realizing all that we might dream. The failure is to fall short of dreaming all that we might realize. So just as we go back from the webcast, from having lunch together, from whatever time we've just spent together, into thinking about our world and our work, just encourage you to think about how we can continue to dream together to realize a better future for all. So with that, just thank you for who you are, for the work you do. I really appreciate and admire so many of you who have joined today's webcast, and the work that you're doing in our communities is what inspires me and keeps me going every day. Invite you to keep in touch as well. There's my email. Always appreciate the chance to learn and grow together as we move through the work and look towards the future. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Shawn. A lot to chew on there. And I loved the quotes about hope and the ways we vision things at the end. That's a great way to connect all of these ideas that we're thinking about. And thank you, everybody that's contributed questions to the chat. So I just wanted to start with one question, which is, this presentation being relatively technical and in some ways perhaps geared towards folks, that are more familiar with the space, or at least like people that are engaged in these types of conversations. I was curious about what types of methods you've used or that you've seen other people use for sharing this information with people in a way that's actionable. And I think a lot of it, that's not meant to sound like a criticism if it is, but it's more just, it's kind of the same dynamic as when you talk about the macro informing the micro and the micro then reinforming the macro. It's like, what are the ways that you engage with information sharing at these different levels? I'm curious if you have any examples of that.
Yeah, no, appreciate the question, Rob. And I enjoyed thinking about this space and this conversation in part because it was kind of this higher level theoretical approach to thinking about systems and dynamics. There are some really great complementary conversations we could have had around how do you put this into practice at a very practical level, the community place-based level. There's a couple of guides that I turn to often. One is a facilitator's guide to participatory decision-making by Sam Kainer. Another is a multi-stakeholder partnership guide that's from a university in the Netherlands. There's all these really great instructional guides that help us say, if we're going to engage in collaborative problem solving, here's the how, the why, and the what's next. And I use those a lot when I work with a particular conversation or with a particular community. I think to me, it starts with a conversation, and the relational piece of this in practice is as simple as saying, what do you hope for your community? And then I'd sit down with you, Rob, we talk about that. We'd say, who else needs to be a part of this conversation? And we build that relationship in a really practical, grounded way. We'd bring in insights and tools and resources from other places. And it would be really grounded in your personality and in your community and your needs. And I think one of the hardest things about this work is that it isn't cookie cutter. It really does depend on that context every time. And so it's hard for me to say, here's here's the prescription, but I can say, here are the principles, here are the tools, here are the resources that would help a particular community, either a community of practice or a community of place, engage in the kind of problem solving that they'd like to.
It's like almost too perfect the way that you talk about these things, because it's a lot of the ways that we talk about it at the Stewardship Network. And what a wonderful, you kind of alluded to it earlier, but how wonderful to be connected to like-minded folks in this space that have been doing this work for a long time. And there's so many people out there that people might not be aware of. It's the same kind of idea of why we see the effectiveness of networking being so important. It's like, you don't know who might be doing this work somewhere else, or you don't know who might be, doing stewardship in the watershed next to yours or anything else. And so just being aware that there are a lot of people doing this work and engaging in these conversations can instill hope, I think, and can be inspiring. And to your point, I think that it's so important to what I see the presentation doing, which I really appreciate in terms of what you were talking about, is it's looking at the high level kind of impacts on societal kind of understandings, and even on like network dynamics of these things that you're talking about on the small scale. It's like, how do you foster a truly collaborative atmosphere that then informs the larger conversation about things? And I guess one question for you, going back to that, conversation about the macro, meso, and micro. So what are ways that you've seen it effective, or how do you, I guess, what are your comments or about the challenges or the opportunities in maintaining individualized identity for those groups in the micro versus making them feel like being a part of the larger picture is important? Because I would imagine that there's some tension there about folks that want to have their own narrative or have their own understandings of things, but also realizing that counterculture is great because it's innovative and it's pushing things forward and it's challenging the status quo. But the real foundational change comes from when those ideas integrate with the larger picture and become more widespread. And so I was curious about, just how you understand the dynamics between maintaining individualized identity versus being a part of this larger picture, and how people understand that.
Yeah, no, love that. How do we become disruptive and subversive in a way that also honors the interdependence that we have across those different scales? And I think that is another relational dynamic to this kind of conversation. I think so often we focus on how can we advance the strategic objectives of a particular place or a particular group without necessarily thinking at the systems level. And I feel like we're often, and this is a fun little trite expression from the strategic planning realm, but culture eats strategy for lunch. And so it doesn't matter if your strategy is great if the culture or the institutional norms or the paradigm is wrong. And I really focus today on that higher level of saying, how can we actually start to shift the paradigm and the systems and the structures so that they're supportive of those place-based efforts? Here, that change happens because of that push that's coming from the place. And so I think what this often looks like for me is honoring that local voice, even when it is disruptive, and saying that that is the kind of conversation that we want to advance. And that in and of itself is never static, right? That's continuing to evolve and shape. To me, it's like, how can we better communicate the importance of that conversation at a systems level? Because the systems they're so slow to shift. They're so right now, I think there's so much serving as barriers to the kind of progress that we want to make, that to me, it's about really listening and honoring what's happening at the place-based, at the community level, and then really thinking critically about how do we bring those voices forward more emphatically within these different spheres where I think different dynamics are at play. It's hard for me to think about the national or state level decision-making apparatuses that we have as really being collaborative in nature right now, or inspiring the kind of systems thinking that's happening at the local level that I think is really representative of that next generation.
Well, thank you so very much, Shawn. And I think that context is so helpful too in thinking about, like you said, many different kind of subtopics of this larger conversation, but thinking about how, some of those resources you shared, individualized kind of tactics for building this collaborative approach and fostering it, which then leads to some of these larger kind of impacts that you discussed. So just want to share my appreciation. Thank you so very much for being here. Thank you to everybody for tuning in. And I've just got a couple of quick outro slides for you. And I will now play from this current slide. Okay, so I am excited to brag on Bob's behalf, but also I will take a little credit myself that the new and improved webcast page for the Stewardship Network is incredible. One of the main reasons why it's incredible is because you can register for the next episode before the upcoming one even starts. So you could have already registered for an upcoming webcast before this webcast even started. In the past, it's been kind of one after another, and you can preview and plan for future episodes. And so we want to tell you about some of the ones that we have coming up here. So next month, we have novel detection technology for hemlock woolly adelgid with Meg Sanders of the Wisconsin Department of Agriculture, Trade, and Consumer Protection. Then we have creating a network of old growth forests in Michigan with Nick Sanchez and Sarah Adlu from the Old Growth Forest Network. And after that, forgive me as I find my cursor, the Great Lakes Piping Plover Road to Recovery with Jillian Farkas of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So please visit stewardshipnetwork.org/webcasts and register for future webcasts. We will send all registered attendees a reminder the morning of, and there are add to calendar links. So don't worry about registering now and then forgetting. We will make sure that you don't. And with that, I just want to once again, thank you so much, Shawn, for being a part of this. It was a wonderful conversation. And thank you to everybody for joining. It really means a lot to us. So have a great rest of the week.